I'll be showing you how to do some weaving on a cardboard loom. So we're going to start by wrapping this cotton cord around the loom. So you start by going around once, pulling it tight and tying a little knot. So I'd make sure to put the knot in between some of those little notches on the weaving card just to help it stay in place. It just makes it that little bit more secure. Tie it really tight and double knot on top of it. If you're struggling with this, ask a grown-up to help you. After you've done a really good knot, wrap your crochet cotton around the board, so you're going all the way around and kind of putting it through all of those little notches. So between each little notch there'll be one line of thread, so that spaces it out in a really good way, so that when you're weaving you've got a really good tension on it. You want to make sure as well that all of your threads are pulled quite tight, not so much that they're bowing the board and making it curve a little bit, but just so there's not so much slack in all of those cords. Keep wrapping around, putting one bit of cord in each little slot until you get to the other side of the board. When you get to the other side, you're going to go all the way to the end of those notches, and then when you get to the end you tie a really good solid knot again, so that the knot sits just on top of one of those end notches. And if you tie the knot so the end of the thread that you're using is attached to the last round of cord that you've done, then it should secure it in a really good way, just like this. So the cord that you're using to wrap around is called crochet cotton, and it's really good and solid and it's not going to break. And the bit that we've just done is called the warp. So the warp is going to support the rest of your weaving, and anything you put afterwards is called the weft. And a good way to remember that is that the weft cords go from right to left. So this next bit is something that you don't have to do, but it does give you a really good start for your weaving that's really nice and supportive for it and helps maintain the structure. So this is creating a header cord. So what you do is get a long piece of the crochet cotton and fold it in half. That folded bit then wraps around that end warp cord and becomes the start of your header cord. So then with that new bit of crochet cotton, you twist those cords over each other, so one goes underneath the next warp cord and the other one goes over the top, and then you twist those cords again, so the one that went over the top before goes under the next time. So you keep doing that the whole way along, and it just creates this really good tension. When you get to the other side, do a really good solid knot and make sure that you kind of pull that header cord quite tight. Now you're ready to start with some proper weaving. So get some of your wool, thread it onto your big chunky plastic needle, and we're going to start with some basic weaving. So what you're doing is going under, over, so using your needle to go over one cord, under the next one, and keep alternating. And then you leave a little tail and tie your yarn onto one of the warp threads, and then you can always weave that tail under and over all of the cords so that it kind of vanishes into the rest of your weaving. And then you can carry on with your normal weaving. And then when you get to the other end, it's really important that when you go back, you're alternating which way you go. So the cords that you went under before, you're going to go over this time. And as you bring it through, you want to make sure that you don't pull it too tight. So just pop your finger on it like that, just to make sure it doesn't come through too far. So you just keep going under, over, alternating between which ones you did before. And then when you get back to the other side, you do the same thing. So now you're going under and over the same ones that you did on your first row. And then remember, as you bring it through, to pop your finger on the end so that it's not going to pull too tight and you get a really nice even bit of weaving. And then just keep going like that. Every so often use your finger to push down your weaving so it compresses it and you've got more room to work. After a while it should start to look like this, where you have a kind of under and over effect and you can't see that much of the cotton cord between everything. When you want to change colour, loop the needle underneath the end warp cord and make a little loop like that. And bring your needle through it to make a good knot on that end cord. And then you cut that off, and like you did at the start, you're going to weave that back into your work so it's not showing. To attach a new bit of yarn, tie it onto the opposite warp cord like you did with the first bit. And then again we'll work that in so it's hidden into your weaving. Then thread up the other end of your yarn, and then you start weaving it back in just as you would have done before. The next technique I'll be showing you is how to do a bit of sumac weaving. So this is a really lovely technique that gives you a really different effect. So you move your needle underneath two of your warp cords like that, and then above where that bit of yarn is, you go under the next two, and it creates this loop effect. So each time you're looping underneath two, so you're going from the right hand to the left hand side, going underneath two of those warp threads and looping around. And depending whether you go under or over those warp cords first, it changes how it looks completely. When you do it from the other direction, you get a completely different effect again. So this way it ends up a little bit more bobbly, but it's still a really lovely effect. So here you can see that subtle difference, but both of them are really gorgeous effects. If you build a few rows of sumac weave up, you end up getting something that's much chunkier and much more 3D than plain weave. So you can always alternate between the two so that you have one more textural element and one slightly flatter element. You can try plain weave using two alternating colours as well, and this will give you more of a checkerboard effect. So you're going to start with one colour as you'd normally do, and just go under, over, doing a nice plain weave. Then once you've done one row, you'd use the second colour. So all of the ones that you've gone under with this one, you would go over with the yellow. So you just keep alternating your colours, so you make sure, as before with normal plain weave, where you went under one cord before, you'll go over the next one. And if you do this for a couple of rows, you'll get a nice colour change like this. You can create interesting patterns and images in your weaving if you don't go across the whole thing. So rather than going all the way to the other edge of the warp, you leave a couple. I would start by just leaving two and then going back on yourself. And then we'll fill it in afterwards with another colour from the other side. This effect is called dovetails, and you can use it to create all different sorts of shapes and patterns. Every time you get to the end of the weaving, so for me I'm doing it on the left hand side where I'm decreasing at the moment, you just do either one or two less. So if you do just one less cord every time, then you get a really slow angle. So I'm going to get a slow slope that's quite shallow going up from the left to the right. But if you miss two cords off every time, it will be a little bit steeper and you'll see a difference a little bit quicker. So now you could really see that start to take shape. So you can do all sorts with this. I tend to create lots of mountains and fields and things like that, but you could create any kind of pattern you like with it. Tie it off like you would with any of your other cords. And then you're going to start from the other side and fill in those gaps. So to start with, you'd only do 3 and go back on yourself. And then every time you do one more cord going across. Always remember to compress it and push it down like you normally would, just to give yourself a really even bit of weaving. You can try using different textures as well. So this yarn that I've just put on is a lot chunkier and kind of squishier than some of the other ones I've used, so you get a really different effect with it. And you're not limited to the things that you've got in the kit as well. You could use anything really. You could cut up some plastic bags and use that in your weaving for a different texture. You could use some ribbons, and you've got some of those in your packs as well. So you can use anything you like really. But if you're using anything around the house, always make sure to ask a grown-up if it's okay to use it before chopping it up. If you want to create more of a kind of image in your weaving, you can always get a template like this little circle I'm using and put that in. And then every time you get to the end of a row and you're kind of at the end of your template, you go back on yourself. So it's sort of like we were just doing with the dovetails, but you're doing it to more of a shape. So with this, we're going to aim for a curve. So with that green, I'm just going to get to the edge of that circle and then go back on myself. Then on the way back you'd do exactly what we've done before, attach a new bit of yarn and then fill in those gaps. Sometimes if you're following an exact shape like this, you end up with one colour where it all finishes on one line, and that just means when you do it from the other direction it can be a little bit tricky to not form a hole in your weaving, but that's okay because you can always leave a hole in intentionally. So you can start to see that hole forming there. But if you didn't want there to be a hole there, you would just use your needle and thread into the other side. So you'd thread into the turquoise from here and that would join them up again. To bring the pieces back together, you just start incorporating the other side of the weaving, and then make sure that as you bring it together, you pull it a little bit tighter than you normally would, so it brings that together a little bit more. You can always alternate which side you work with as well, so you can build it up as you go along and do one row of the green and one row of the turquoise, so that you decide what you're doing as you work with it. When there's been a gap, there'll always be a little bit where the texture's slightly different, and that's just because all of those warp chords are a little bit further apart, so you get a bit of a flatter area. The next technique I'll show you is weft twinning. So this is very similar to the header chords that we had at the start. So you get a doubled over piece of yarn and you tie it around the end warped chord like that. So it's kind of doubling over and then you pull it through that loop that you've made. And then you get each chord and one goes underneath, one goes over the top, and then you twist them so that the one that went over the top before now goes underneath. With the dovetail bits below with the different colours, I didn't fill them in completely, so that with this row that goes across the whole thing, I can push it down and compress it and you get a really nice wave, and it just gives you a more smooth, rounded finish than doing the dovetail effects, which can look a little bit blocky and linear. If you're doing something like that, make sure that you keep pushing the line that you're working on down, just so that it doesn't lift too much and lose that lovely curved shape. I've tied on another bit of turquoise here so that you can see the difference with some weft twinning between the thinner yarn and the chunkier yarn, and how with the chunkier yarn you'll get a really nice bold effect. For the next technique you'll need a pencil or something similar, and this is called tufting. So with this we're going to do plain weave, but every so often going to bring the needle up and wrap the yarn around the pencil. And it's best to wrap it round, and then I tend to twist it a full 360 degrees around that loop that I've just created, and then go back into the weave, do another little bit of plain weave, and then do another bit of tufting and wrap around it. And this works really well if you do quite chunky yarn or doubled up yarn, so that it's really obvious. And I always think it's really nice to do quite a lot of rows of this. And you don't have to go the whole way across with it. You could always do 1/4 of it with lots of bobbly bits, or just a few lines of it and then do a bit of plain weave over the rest of it. It's completely up to you, and you can get really creative with it. As well as doubling up the chords, if you want, you can always do 4 chords. You could do more than that if you wanted a section that was really thick and chunky and you wanted to fill an area quite quickly. You can use lots of different bits and bobs. So here's the tufted bits up close, so you get this really lovely rounded texture. So this technique is called basket weaving. So you either, instead of going under and over 1 chord at a time, you go under or over either 2 or 4 chords. So here I'm going over 4 chords and then under 4 chords, but you can do it where you're going over 2, under 2. And that's just another slightly different texture for you to try out. You don't have to end your weaving this way, but I quite like doing lots of little trailing bits just to give it a little bit of texture. So if it's hanging on a wall, you've got something really nice hanging down. So cut lots of little lengths of your thread, and this is doing some lark's head knots again. So wrap all of your short lengths around 4 of the warp cords so that you've got the folded section at the back, but then bring it up to the front and bring those tails down between it, so that you've got this nice flat section at the top and lots of tails floating down. So let's try that again. So you've got that looped section, you bring the back up through the middle of the 4 cords, so you've got 2 either side, pull it tight, and then manoeuvre it back up to the top. To hold them in place and give them a little bit of stability, I would recommend lifting them up and doing a little bit of plain weave underneath just to hold it all in place. And then when you've done a few lines of that, just push it all up so it condenses all of your weaving and makes it look really nice. So then to finish it off, we're going to do another header cord like we did at the top. So just get some of that cotton cord, fold it in half, wrap it around one of the warp threads at the end, and then do like you were doing with the weft twinning and wrap it around each one. So twist it, go underneath with one cord and over the top with the other, and make sure you keep pulling it to keep that tension. Do that with the whole thing, and then once you get to the other side, you just pull it tight and then tie it off. And as you've warped up the whole thing and it's double-sided, before cutting it all off, I would recommend doing another on the other side as well. Now that you've got to grips with weaving, you can get really experimental on the other side. So you can probably see I've put a bit of paper underneath with a drawing on. So that's just got lots of different lines so that I can decide what kind of patterns I want to do on it. You can introduce lots of different texture as well. Like I really like this kind of pom-pom wool that we put in the packs. So you can just use that on bulk or just as a single strand to give yourself a little bit more texture. So you can see here just how chunky that kind of pom-pom wool is compared to the next kind of yarn I'm going to use. So once you're all done with it, it's time to take it off the board, and then you can reuse the board and do as many as you like. On one side of your bit of weaving, chop all of the end cords, and if you're worried about this, I would leave a bigger section than I have towards the end of your weaving so it's easier to tie a knot with it. Once you've cut them all, get 2 of the warp cords and tie them together, and I would do a really good solid double knot on top of each one. This bit can take quite a bit of patience and can be a little bit fiddly, so just take your time and don't get too stressed with it. Do this on both sides of your bits of weaving so it secures them all and holds them together. Once you've tied everything off on one side, you can get the other bit that should still be attached like this and just cut right down the middle. Once you've cut through it, you're doing the exact same thing of getting 2 of the warp cords and tying them together really solidly. And keep doing that on both of your sets of weaving. After you've tied them all off, you'll have 2 finished bits of weaving. You can trim all of those edges off if you like, or leave them as they are, and then you can rewarp your card and start again if you like.